as we look at to William Wordsworth, there, Coleridge definitely praising Wordsworth's work, and that idea, the building up of a human spirit, that yes, you've done the vital breathings of the soul, thoughts too deep for words, that he's highly praising it as a theme, heart is high, and the image there of particularly the issues with France, and being there in the middle of all that hopeful period that gets struck down, and particularly calling it in line 45 an Orphic song. That comparing Wordsworth to the great poet Orpheus, who is good enough that he almost let his wife out of hell. So notice, though, particularly in the fourth stanza, that as he thinks about Wordsworth, he puts Wordsworth, before you ever finished reading the poem, I already had you, line 49, in the choir of ever-enduring men. You are a poet whose work is going to last. You'll be there forever. That since they're all one age. The who cares when Homer was born, or when Shakespeare was born, or now when Wordsworth was born. They're all contemporaries. They're all, will always endure, Coleridge says. That sense of permanent and part of a sacred role and among the archives of mankind. This poem shows what a great poet you are, friend Wordsworth. But notice, as a good romantic, you can't be that focused on somebody else. Coleridge is going to have to get in, even in this poem of praise to Wordsworth. There's going to be the poor me bit. And again, I so feel for him, but I also think what a shame that you can't congratulate your friend without pointing out to him yourself. But here in this, notice there, you're doing these wonderful things, and you've even made me, there's 62, the pulses of my being beat anew, as life returns upon the drowned. Hearing you do this, I've come home, I'm on my way, and I'm doing poetry. You've even, brought the drowned back to life again for a few minutes. But that sense there, it's still painful for me, and then there's still fears, and then there's hope, and then that line 69, sense of past youth and manhood come in vain. I had such promise, I've got such talent, genius given, knowledge won in vain, but I've wasted it. Here he is. And so that image, you're going to be in the choir of ever-enduring men, Wordsworth, but where I'll be, there, line 73, flowers strewed, they're going to be doing my funeral. You're going to endure, you'll last forever, but there, I'm going to be in a coffin. I'm just going to be ordinary. And then the next stanza, he knows this, that way no more wait. Just like we saw him back in dejection say, hence viper thoughts, I can't stay in this frame of mind. Here, I can't think about this. That's harmful to me, but also it ill beseems me. Hey, we're celebrating what you're doing, Wordsworth. And there, 79, it's unhealthful for me. I'm plucking the poisons of self-harm. This is almost suicidal to talk like this. So meanwhile, sage bard, wonderful Wordsworth, don't let remembering my painful background make the memory of that reading for you anything, or the celebration of how good we can tell you're going to be. Don't let that impair that, and please don't think less of me. Don't impair that communion with my nobler mind. I'm better than this. I could be better. You've already pitied me too long. The mixed emotions we see running through this, but also, throughout, definitely, there, that line 95, that I just listened, just kind of passive. I just listened and was overwhelmed and wowed by this. So yes, Wordsworth, you're my comforter, you're my guide. That room with all those happy faces and being with you at this time. But that idea, that I was so mesmerized that I barely knew when you stopped reading. And that, hey, I've written a poem now, but kind of leaving there that was it thought? Was it aspiration? Was it resolve? But anyway, when I left there, I found myself in prayer. I've been in the presence of greatness, and his praise for that. Coleridge Epitaph. Notice, stop, Christian, stop, child of God. When you're passing my tombstone, be aware there's a poet here. But notice his play on, back in Ancient Mariner, that death and life we met. That sense of being a soul who, while he's living, is pretty well dead. Sort of like our mariner's life wasn't much there when he was lost on that sea. That prayer here from Coleridge, that I'll find life in death. Maybe this life was pretty dead for me, but in eternity, will death itself be an eternal life? A more eternal joy, that sense of being forgiven, and that also there, I'm hoping that through Christ and that advice to us to do thou the same. That epitaph typically ends collections of Coleridge's poetry. Let's look a bit at Biographia Literaria and notice here points where, Coleridge is one of the authors back there of lyrical ballads. But when Wordsworth writes, particularly that 1802 preface, we've got a Coleridge who, wait a minute, Wordsworth, I don't know that I agree with you on some things. And here in his literary biography, he wants to set the record straight as well as do some just criticism. Coleridge, one of the early detailed critics of literature, and as we're looking here, Wordsworth, from the start, hey, in descriptive sketches, knew you were a great poet, and that sense of the language as strong, but at times naughty and contorted as by its own impatient strength. But hey, in reading your very first stuff, the sense from Coleridge that Wordsworth was, a great poet. I'm looking on down probably about the second large paragraph in your text. Before that was sun and moon section and stars that's inserted. It was the union of deep feeling with profound thought. And I think, does this seem a pretty accurate description of Wordsworth? The fine balance of truth in observing with the imaginative faculty in modifying the objects observed. And above all, the original gift of spreading the tone, the atmosphere, and with it the depth and height of the ideal world, around forms, incidents, and situations of which, for the common view, custom had bedimmed all the luster. So yes, with Wordsworth we see a lot of ordinary scenes. He wants us from back in Simon Lee. When you pass an old man that maybe we just see as so ordinary we don't pay any attention to, that suddenly he sparked in us a sense of what's special about that moment and made us think about that moment. So that sense too of carrying the feelings of childhood into the powers of manhood, to combine the child's sense of wonder and novelty with everyday appearances, that I think that is pretty descriptive of Wordsworth's genius. Notice too the definitions he has for imagination versus fancy. Imagination by far the greater of the two there, because of its connection with God, the prime creator, and seeing in the poet someone who's imitating the action of the infinite I am on a much lesser scale, and having to use things already created by the creator, but that sense that the poet also makes something from nothing, only using, not total blankness, but using the things of God's creation. And then the fancy, just reassembling things that already exist. The two cardinal points of poetry that he mentions in chapter 14, the idea of using nature and the way the coloring of the imagination, and that he and Wordsworth, this description of them, how they started the whole idea of lyrical ballads. That Wordsworth was supposed to do the ordinary and make us see things in it unusual by its imaginative coloring, by the burst of emotion that's tied to that ordinary, like just a regular moon going behind a cottage, or something like seeing someone like Simon Lee, or revisiting a place 5 years after you've been there in Tintern Abbey. That he wants us to see the marvelous in the ordinary. And notice Coleridge's part in poems like Rime of the Ancient Mariner. He's to take the supernatural, this weird, strange stuff, and then out of this weird supernatural to help us relate it to common everyday life. So they're kind of opposite approaches there to how they address the ordinary, but having us see truth through both approaches. Other things we want to notice particularly. The definition of poetry, and this is a couple paragraphs after the 30 days, has September little section there. A poem is that species of composition which is opposed to works of science by proposing for its immediate object pleasure, not truth. And from all other species, proposing to itself such delight from the whole as is compatible with a distinct gratification from each component part. That's Coleridge's definition of poem, and his focus there on a harmonious whole. Right before chapter 17, I think very interesting, his definition there of good sense, and fancy is the drapery of that good sense. I think those are the key things coming out of Coleridge. One other thing I would mention in linking with Coleridge, notice that he does tackle Wordsworth on two issues that he doesn't. The idea that a common man speaks better than everybody and is able to imagine better thoughts. Coleridge has an issue with that. He also disagrees with Wordsworth on the idea that a poem can essentially be prose. And Coleridge isn't going to agree with him on those lines. That's their two chief points of difference as poet. Let's jump over to Charles Lamb for a minute, the guy there who doesn't care if he never sees another mountain in his life, if he's never with Wordsworth and Coleridge. Notice in Old China, though, that like the other Romantic poets we've seen, Lamb as essayist, and here he writes the Elia essays, pretending, to be a person named Elia, who, if you take those Elia, notice that will also, you reverse those letters, you're doing a lie, but places himself, and this is your Mary Lamb, who the tragic history of her having killed their mother in just in such mental stress that she did that, and then for the rest of her life, whenever she would have moments of high distress, people would see Charles and Mary going down the street, both weeping, and Mary taking the straitjacket and taking her back to the insane asylum. So a tragic life on the part of Lamb. But as we see in Old China, his love an association with objects.